Across more than 4,000 years of human memory, the story of a single tower has persisted through the collapse of empires, the extinction of languages, and the disappearance of entire civilizations that once dominated the ancient world. The account appears in Hebrew scripture, composed during the Babylonian exile, in Greek historical texts written by travelers who claim to have witnessed the structure's remains, in Islamic traditions that name the king who ordered its construction, in medieval European manuscripts that depicted it as a spiral ascending toward an angry heaven, and in cuneiform tablets recovered from the sands of Iraq that describe a ziggurat whose summit was intended to reach the realm of the gods themselves. The narrative of humanity's first great act of collective hubris, punished by the fracturing of a single tongue into the bewildering multiplicity of human speech, has shaped theological understanding, architectural ambition, and philosophical speculation about the origins of linguistic diversity from the ancient Near East to the present day. But in the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers deposited the sediment that would become the foundation of the world's first urban civilization, the structures that inspired this persistent legend were not mythological constructions, but physical monuments whose ruins can still be identified by archaeologists working in modern Iraq. The ziggurats that dominated the skylines of Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cities represented the most ambitious architectural undertakings of the ancient world, massive stepped platforms of mud brick that required the coordinated labor of thousands of workers over generations of sustained effort. These temple mountains served as the earthly residences of divine beings whose favor determined the prosperity of kingdoms and the fertility of fields, their summits providing the sacred space where heaven and earth were understood to intersect in ways that made communication between human and divine possible. This is the story of the Tower of Babel, from the prehistoric development of monumental architecture in the marshlands of early Sumer, through the construction of the great ziggurats at Ur, Uruk, and Babylon itself, the political and religious contexts that motivated such extraordinary expenditure of resources, the Babylonian exile that brought Hebrew captives into direct contact with these monuments, the composition of the Genesis account that would transmit the tower's memory to subsequent millennia, the medieval and Renaissance interpretations that shaped European understanding of the narrative, the archaeological excavations that revealed the physical structures underlying the legend, and the ongoing scholarly debates about the relationship between historical ziggurats and the biblical account that transformed a Mesopotamian religious monument into humanity's most enduring symbol of overreaching ambition. The landscape into which the first ziggurats would eventually rise began taking shape approximately 10,000 years before the present era, when the glaciers of the last ice age released their accumulated waters and the Persian Gulf extended northward into the lowlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The region that would become southern Mesopotamia existed as a zone of marshes, lagoons, and seasonally flooded plains where the two great rivers deposited enormous quantities of silt carried down from the mountains of eastern Anatolia. This alluvial environment created conditions of extraordinary agricultural potential, as the annual flooding renewed soil fertility in ways that could support dense human populations. But it also presented fundamental challenges that would shape every aspect of the civilizations that emerged within it. The complete absence of stone, timber, and mineral resources in the southern plains meant that the inhabitants of this region would be forced to develop building technologies based entirely on the materials that the landscape provided in abundance, namely the clay from the riverbeds and the reeds that grew in profusion throughout the marshlands. The earliest permanent settlements in southern Mesopotamia emerged during the Ubaid period, conventionally dated between approximately 6,500 and 3,800 years before the Common Era, when communities of farmers and herders established villages along the natural levees that formed beside river channels. These early inhabitants developed the techniques of mud brick construction that would remain the foundation of Mesopotamian architecture throughout the region's entire history, molding the clay-rich soil into rectangular blocks that were dried in the intense summer sun and then stacked to form walls, platforms, and eventually the massive temple structures that dominated later cities. The Ubaid period also witnessed the emergence of the religious practices and architectural forms that would evolve into the ziggurat tradition, as communities constructed small shrines and temples on raised platforms that elevated sacred space above the flood-prone surrounding landscape. The transformation from Ubaid village culture to the urban civilization of the Uruk period, spanning approximately 4,000 to 3,100 years before the Common Era, represented one of the most consequential transitions in human history. The city of Uruk itself, located in the southern region of Sumer that the Babylonians would later call the land of the Chaldeans, grew to encompass an estimated 40,000 inhabitants within its walls, making it the largest human settlement that had ever existed up to that point in time. The administrative requirements of managing such an unprecedented concentration of population stimulated the development of writing, numerical notation, and bureaucratic record-keeping systems that would spread throughout the ancient Near East, and eventually influence the development of literate civilization across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The temple complexes that dominated Uruk during this period established the architectural vocabulary that would characterize Mesopotamian sacred architecture for the following 3 millennia. The Eanna precinct, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, who would later be known to the Akkadians and Babylonians as Ishtar, consisted of multiple structures arranged around courtyards and platforms, with the most sacred buildings positioned atop elevated foundations that raised them above the surrounding urban fabric. The practice of constructing new temples directly on top of the ruins of earlier structures, rather than clearing the older buildings and beginning fresh construction at ground level, created the accumulated height that would eventually produce the distinctive stepped profile of the fully developed ziggurat. Each generation of temple builders added another layer to the sacred mound, expressing both continuity with ancestral religious practices and the increasing ambition of communities that commanded ever greater labor resources. The ziggurat, as a distinct architectural form, achieved its mature expression during the Third Dynasty of Ur, which ruled southern Mesopotamia from approximately 2112 to 2004 years before the Common Era, under kings whose building programs transformed the major cities of Sumer into showcases of royal piety and administrative competence. The ziggurat that the founder of this dynasty, Ur-Nammu, constructed at the city of Ur, represents the best preserved example of this architectural tradition, its massive brick core surviving to the present day as a monument to the organizational capabilities of early Bronze Age civilization. This structure rose in 3-step stages above a base, measuring approximately 64 meters in length and 46 meters in width, with the uppermost platform originally supporting a temple dedicated to the moon god Nana, the patron deity of Ur, whose worship dominated the religious life of the city for more than 2,000 years. The construction of such monuments required the coordination of resources, labor, and technical expertise on a scale that modern observers sometimes struggle to appreciate when confronting the weathered remains of these ancient structures. The core of a typical ziggurat consisted of millions of mud bricks, each individually molded, dried, and transported to the construction site, where specialized workers positioned them according to engineering principles that had been refined over centuries of accumulated experience. The exterior surfaces received additional layers of fired brick, whose greater durability protected the mud brick core from the erosion that would otherwise have reduced these monuments to shapeless mounds within a few generations. Drainage systems incorporated into the design channeled rainwater away from the vulnerable interior, while the stepped profile of the structure distributed weight in ways that prevented the kind of structural failure that threatened any massive mud brick construction. The religious significance of these structures extended far beyond their function as elevated platforms for temple buildings. Mesopotamian cosmology understood the universe as consisting of multiple layers, with the heavens inhabited by the great gods forming the uppermost realm, the earth where humans dwelt occupying the middle zone, and the underworld of the dead lying beneath the surface in darkness and dust. The ziggurat represented the point of connection between these cosmic levels, a manufactured mountain that replicated in the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia, the sacred peaks where divine power was understood to manifest most directly. The very name applied to these structures in the Sumerian language conveyed this vertical cosmological function, as the term that modern scholars typically translate as ziggurat derived from a verbal root meaning to build high or to raise up toward the heavens. The political dimensions of ziggurat construction proved equally significant in shaping the development of this architectural tradition throughout Mesopotamian history. Kings who undertook the construction or restoration of these monuments proclaimed their piety and legitimacy through inscriptions that detailed their devotion to the gods whose earthly residences they had provided or maintained. The completion of a ziggurat demonstrated not only the ruler's relationship with divine powers, but also his command over the administrative apparatus capable of organizing such massive projects, his control over the agricultural surplus necessary to support the workforce, and his ability to maintain peaceful conditions throughout the extended construction period. Royal inscriptions from throughout Mesopotamian history record the ziggurat building activities of kings who understood these projects as essential demonstrations of the qualities that distinguished legitimate sovereignty from mere military dominance. The political and religious landscape of Mesopotamia underwent fundamental transformation during the second millennium before the Common Era. As the Sumerian-speaking populations of the southern cities gradually merged with Akkadian-speaking Semitic peoples, whose influence had been expanding throughout the region since the imperial unification briefly achieved by Sargon of Akkad around 2,334 years before the Common Era. The city of Babylon, located in the northern portion of the alluvial plain where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers approached most closely, before diverging toward the Persian Gulf, rose to prominence during this period under a dynasty whose most famous representative, Hammurabi, ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 years before the Common Era. Hammurabi's law code and his consolidation of power over southern Mesopotamia established Babylon as a center of political and cultural significance that would endure through centuries of subsequent political transformation. The Ziggurat of Babylon, which would eventually become the structure most directly associated with the Tower of Babel tradition, received attention from multiple rulers throughout the city's long history as a major religious and political center. Ancient Mesopotamian texts referred to this monument by the Sumerian ceremonial name Itemenanki, a designation that scholars have translated as meaning the temple that is the foundation of heaven and earth, or alternatively, the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. This name explicitly expressed the cosmological function that Mesopotamian religious understanding attributed to such structures, identifying the ziggurat as the point where the vertical axis connecting the divine and human realms intersected with the horizontal plane of earthly existence. The history of Babylon and its ziggurat entered a new phase during the first millennium before the Common Era, when the ancient city experienced periods of destruction, abandonment, and reconstruction that would ultimately shape the memories preserved in later textual traditions. The Assyrian Empire, whose capital cities lay in the northern regions of Mesopotamia along the upper Tigris River, exercised intermittent control over Babylon throughout much of this period, with Assyrian kings alternating between policies of destruction intended to eliminate a rival center of power and policies of restoration designed to demonstrate their legitimacy as heirs to the ancient traditions of Mesopotamian civilization. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled from approximately 705 to 681 years before the Common Era, famously ordered the destruction of Babylon in 689 after the city's repeated rebellions against Assyrian authority, an act of devastation that subsequent generations remembered with horror, and that Sennacherib's own successors sought to reverse through ambitious programs of reconstruction. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that emerged in the aftermath of Assyrian collapse represented both a continuation of ancient Mesopotamian traditions and a self-conscious effort to restore the glories of earlier periods that Babylonian intellectuals remembered as golden ages of cultural achievement. The king, Nabopolassar, who founded this dynasty and ruled from approximately 626 to 605 years before the Common Era, initiated programs of temple reconstruction throughout his realm that his son and successor Nebuchadnezzar II would continue on an even grander scale. The Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar constructed during his reign from approximately 605 to 562 years before the Common Era became one of the largest and most impressive cities of the ancient world. Its walls, temples, palaces, and processional ways representing the culmination of Mesopotamian urban planning and monumental architecture. The reconstruction of Etemenanke under Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar produced the ziggurat that ancient visitors would describe with wonder, and that modern archaeologists have attempted to reconstruct from the surviving evidence of foundation traces and textual descriptions. A cuneiform tablet, known to scholars as the Esagila tablet, dating from approximately the Seleucid period following the Macedonian conquest of the Persian Empire, preserves measurements and descriptions of the temple complex at Babylon that include detailed information about the ziggurat's dimensions. According to this text, the ziggurat rose in 7 stages above a base measuring approximately 91 meters on each side, with the total height of the structure approximately equaling the length of its base, creating a monument that would have dominated the skyline of Babylon and the surrounding plain from distances of many kilometers in every direction. The populations that Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns brought to Babylon as deportees during the early 6th century before the Common Era included significant numbers of inhabitants from the Kingdom of Judah, whose capital city of Jerusalem had been conquered and whose temple had been destroyed in 586 years before the Common Era. These Judean exiles found themselves forcibly resettled in a metropolitan environment utterly different from the hill country of their homeland, confronting architectural monuments and religious practices that represented both the overwhelming power of their Babylonian captors and the apparent validation of the gods whom the Babylonians worshipped. The ziggurat of Etemenanke, rising above the city that now held them captive, would have represented a visible symbol of everything that seemed to contradict the religious claims of their ancestral tradition regarding the exclusive sovereignty of the God whose temple in Jerusalem had proven powerless to prevent the Babylonian conquest. The composition of the Hebrew texts that would eventually form the biblical account of the Tower of Babel cannot be dated with precision, though scholars generally associate the narrative with either the period of the Babylonian exile itself or with the subsequent centuries when Jewish communities continued to reflect upon the experience of captivity and return. The account preserved in the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis presents a remarkably compressed narrative that describes humanity's attempt to construct a city and tower whose top would reach into heaven, the divine response of confusing human language to prevent the completion of this project, and the subsequent scattering of the previously unified human population across the face of the earth. The text derives the name Babel from a Hebrew root meaning to confuse or to mix, creating an etymology that associated the city's name with the punishment that the story recounts, while also providing an apparent explanation for the observable diversity of human languages. The relationship between this biblical account and the physical ziggurat that the exiles would have observed in Babylon has generated extensive scholarly discussion regarding the sources, purposes, and interpretive frameworks that shape the composition of the Genesis narrative. The most straightforward reading of the evidence suggests that Judean observers confronting the massive ziggurat of Etemenanke and perhaps hearing Babylonian explanations of its religious purpose as a structure intended to reach toward the realm of the gods, reinterpreted this monument through the lens of their own theological commitments as an act of hubris that had been appropriately punished by divine intervention. The ruined or incomplete state of the ziggurat during various periods of its history would have supported such an interpretation, as the exiles could have pointed to the monument's deteriorated condition as evidence that the builders had failed to accomplish their divine ambitions. The Babylonian texts that describe Etemenanke and its religious function present a perspective fundamentally different from the condemnation implicit in the biblical account. Mesopotamian building inscriptions present ziggurat construction as an act of piety commanded by the gods themselves, with kings who undertook such projects described as fulfilling divine instructions rather than challenging divine prerogatives. The purpose of the structure was not to invade the heavenly realm, but to provide an appropriate dwelling place for the deity, whose presence blessed the city and ensured its prosperity, with the summit temple serving as the location where the god could rest when descending from heaven to interact with human worshippers. The contrast between this indigenous understanding and the biblical interpretation highlights the degree to which the Genesis account represented a critical response to Mesopotamian religious claims rather than a neutral description of historical events. The textual tradition of the Tower of Babel narrative continued to develop throughout the centuries following its initial composition, as Jewish, Christian, and eventually Islamic interpreters elaborated the compressed biblical account with additional details, explanations, and theological applications. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, writing in Greek for educated readers throughout the Roman world, identified the tower's builder as Nimrod, a figure mentioned briefly in the Genesis genealogies as a mighty hunter before the Lord and as the ruler of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. This identification, which drew connections between scattered references in the Hebrew text, established a tradition that would persist throughout medieval interpretation, providing the narrative with a named antagonist whose personal ambition and defiance of divine authority could be explored through moral and theological analysis. Islamic tradition, which incorporated and transformed many elements of biblical narrative, preserved accounts of the tower's construction that associated the project with rulers known by names including Nimrod, and also identified the structure with locations throughout the ancient Near East. The ruins of the Great Ziggurat at Borsippa, located approximately 18 kilometers southwest of Babylon proper and dedicated to the god Nabu, attracted particular attention from medieval travelers and scholars who identified this impressive monument as the remains of the original Tower of Babel. The Borsippa Ziggurat, whose partially vitrified brickwork had been dramatically affected by fire damage at some point in antiquity, presented an appearance that seemed to confirm narratives of divine destruction, its fused and distorted ruins suggesting catastrophic intervention in ways that the more thoroughly eroded remains at Babylon itself did not. The transmission of the Tower of Babel narrative into medieval European consciousness occurred primarily through the Latin biblical text that formed the foundation of Western Christian religious education. The account's brevity in the original Hebrew text, consisting of only 9 verses in the standard chapter division, provided ample space for interpretive elaboration by readers seeking to understand the narrative's theological implications and historical relationships. Medieval Christian interpreters developed extensive commentary traditions that explored questions including the height that the tower had attained before its abandonment, the number and identity of the languages into which human speech had been divided, the fate of the builders following the confusion of tongues, and the relationship between this punishment and subsequent human history, including the eventual redemption narrative that Christian theology understood the Hebrew scriptures as anticipating. The visual representation of the Tower of Babel in medieval and Renaissance European art created iconographic traditions that continue to shape popular understanding of the narrative despite their lack of any direct connection to the historical appearance of Mesopotamian ziggurats. Artists who had never encountered ancient Near Eastern architecture and who worked from textual descriptions that provided minimal visual detail necessarily drew upon building traditions familiar from their own environments when depicting the tower. Medieval manuscript illuminations frequently represented the structure as a castle or church tower of contemporary European design, while Renaissance and early modern painters, including Peter Bruegel the Elder, created images that combined elements of Roman architecture, contemporary construction techniques, and imaginative elaboration into depictions that bear no resemblance to the stepped mud brick platforms that actually dominated ancient Mesopotamian skylines. The famous painting produced by Peter Bruegel the Elder in 1563, now housed in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, established a visual conception of the Tower of Babel that has influenced subsequent representation of the narrative to the present day. Bruegel depicted a massive spiral structure resembling the Roman Colosseum transformed into a tower, its multiple levels populated by tiny figures engaged in various construction activities, while the surrounding landscape and harbor suggest the busy commercial life of a thriving metropolis. This representation, while entirely anachronistic in its architectural vocabulary, captured the narrative's themes of collective human ambition and the scale of organization required for monumental construction in ways that connected the ancient story to the experiences of viewers in 16th century Europe, where cathedral construction and other major building projects continued to demonstrate the possibilities and limitations of coordinated human effort. The archaeological investigation of Mesopotamian ziggurats, which began in earnest during the 19th century when European explorers and scholars gained access to the Ottoman-controlled territories of modern Iraq, gradually revealed the physical structures underlying the literary traditions that had preserved the Tower of Babel narrative through millennia of transmission and interpretation. The German architect and archaeologist Robert Koldewey conducted systematic excavations at Babylon from 1899 to 1917, uncovering substantial remains of the Neo-Babylonian city, including the foundations of the Ziggurat Etemenanke, the processional way decorated with glazed brick reliefs, and portions of the palace complex that had served as the administrative center of Nebuchadnezzar's empire. These excavations confirmed the existence of the massive ziggurat that ancient texts described, while also revealing the extent of destruction and removal that had occurred during the centuries following Babylon's decline as a major urban center. The foundations that Koldewey uncovered indicated a structure whose scale substantially exceeded that of any other ziggurat known from the archaeological record, with the base platform measuring approximately 90 meters on each side, and the accumulated debris suggesting a monument whose original height had indeed been impressive by any standard of comparison. The core of the ziggurat had been almost entirely removed during centuries of brick robbing, as later inhabitants of the region had systematically dismantled the ancient monument to obtain building materials for their own construction projects. This process of destruction, which had reduced other ancient ziggurats to barely recognizable mounds, had been particularly thorough at Babylon. On leaving only the foundation levels and a massive central pit where the core structure had once stood. The political circumstances of the 20th century repeatedly interrupted archaeological investigation of Babylon and complicated efforts to preserve the remains that successive excavations revealed. The region's transformation from Ottoman territory to British mandate to independent Iraqi state created administrative discontinuities that affected the management of archaeological sites and the disposition of excavated materials. The subsequent decades of political instability, international conflict, and regime change in Iraq produced additional obstacles to systematic investigation while also threatening the surviving remains through both deliberate damage and neglect. The reconstruction efforts undertaken during the regime of Saddam Hussein, which sought to rebuild portions of ancient Babylon using modern materials and methods, generated controversy among archaeologists and heritage specialists who questioned both the accuracy of these reconstructions and their impact on the surviving ancient remains. The relationship between the archaeological evidence recovered from Mesopotamian sites and the biblical account preserved in Genesis continues to generate scholarly discussion regarding the historical dimensions of narratives that clearly incorporate legendary and theological elements alongside whatever kernel of historical memory they may preserve. The Genesis account does not describe a ziggurat in architectural terms recognizable from Mesopotamian evidence, referring instead to a tower whose top would reach unto heaven in language that suggests distance from direct observation of such structures. The motivation, attributed to the builders in the biblical text, that they sought to make a name for themselves lest they be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth, reflects concerns about collective identity and dispersion that may have resonated with the experiences of exiled communities for whom the narrative served as an explanation of how humanity had arrived at its present fragmented condition. The linguistic diversity that the Tower of Babel narrative purports to explain has itself become a subject of scientific investigation through the development of historical linguistics and comparative philology during the 19th and 20th centuries. The reconstruction of language families and the identification of relationships between languages spoken across vast geographic areas revealed patterns of differentiation and divergence that could be analyzed using systematic methods, though the ultimate origins of linguistic diversity remained beyond the reach of techniques that depended upon the comparison of documented languages. The question of whether humanity had ever spoken a single original language, sometimes referred to as the proto-human or proto-world language, has attracted speculation from scholars across multiple disciplines, though the consensus of contemporary linguistics regards such questions as effectively unanswerable, given the time depths involved and the limitations of comparative method when applied to relationships more ancient than approximately 10,000 years. The theological and philosophical interpretations of the Tower of Babel narrative have continued to evolve in response to changing intellectual contexts and contemporary concerns. Readers in various periods have understood the story as addressing questions of human pride and divine judgment, the origins of cultural and linguistic diversity, the possibilities and limitations of collective human action, and the relationship between technological capability and moral restraint. Modern interpretations have sometimes emphasized the positive dimensions of diversity that the narrative's conclusion describes, reading the scattering of humanity across the earth and the multiplication of languages not as pure punishment, but as the divine provision of the conditions necessary for the full flowering of human cultural creativity. This reading, which inverts the traditional interpretation of the story as a narrative of judgment, reflects contemporary valuations of diversity and pluralism that earlier interpreters would not necessarily have shared. The architectural legacy of the ziggurat tradition extends beyond the specific structures that inspired the Tower of Babel narrative to influence subsequent building traditions throughout the ancient Near East and possibly beyond. The stepped pyramid forms that appeared in various ancient cultures, from the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica to the temple towers of Southeast Asia, have attracted speculation regarding possible connections to Mesopotamian prototypes, though establishing direct relationships between such widely separated traditions presents methodological challenges that scholars have not definitively resolved. The influence of Mesopotamian religious architecture on the temple traditions of adjacent regions including Syria, Anatolia, and the Levant appears more securely established, as the cultural interactions documented throughout the Bronze Age created conditions for the transmission of architectural concepts alongside other elements of material culture, religious practice, and social organization. The transformation of our understanding regarding these ancient structures and the narratives they inspired required the development of entirely new disciplines and methodologies that emerged only gradually during the 19th and 20th centuries. The archaeological excavations that revealed the physical remains of Mesopotamian ziggurats represented merely one dimension of a broader intellectual enterprise that sought to reconstruct the worldviews, social organizations, and religious conceptions of civilizations that had flourished millennia before the earliest records of classical antiquity. The decipherment of cuneiform script, accomplished through the painstaking efforts of scholars including Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert during the middle decades of the 19th century, opened access to textual sources that had remained incomprehensible for over 2,000 years, creating possibilities for understanding Mesopotamian civilization from the inside, rather than solely through the external observations of Greek historians or the brief allusions preserved in biblical literature. The corpus of cuneiform texts that accumulated in museum collections throughout the world during the century, following decipherment, revealed a literary and religious tradition of unexpected sophistication and complexity, including mythological narratives, historical chronicles, administrative records, legal codes, astronomical observations, mathematical treatises, and ritual instructions that illuminated virtually every dimension of Mesopotamian life and thought. The relationship between the textual evidence recovered from Mesopotamian archives and the narratives preserved in the Hebrew Bible became a subject of intense scholarly investigation as the connections between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions became increasingly apparent. The discovery and publication of the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish by George Smith in 1876, following his earlier recovery of the Gilgamesh flood narrative, demonstrated that Hebrew and Mesopotamian traditions shared mythological themes and narrative elements whose relationship required explanation. The question of whether biblical authors had borrowed directly from Mesopotamian sources, whether both traditions drew upon common ancient Near Eastern heritage, or whether the similarities reflected parallel but independent developments, generated extensive scholarly debate that continues to inform contemporary discussions of these texts. The Tower of Babel narrative, situated within the primeval history that occupies the opening chapters of Genesis, participates in this broader pattern of relationship between Hebrew and Mesopotamian traditions, though the specific sources or influences that shaped its present form have proven difficult to identify with precision. The compositional history of the Genesis narratives has itself become a subject of extensive scholarly investigation, as the application of source-critical and redaction-critical methods to the Pentateuch revealed evidence of multiple authorial hands and editorial processes that contributed to the formation of these texts over extended periods. The Tower of Babel narrative, as preserved in Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 through 9, displays features that scholars have associated with various proposed sources of the Pentateuch, though the attribution of specific passages to particular documentary sources remains contested among specialists who have proposed alternative models for understanding the compositional processes that produce these texts. The narrative's concern with explaining the origins of linguistic diversity and the dispersion of humanity across the earth positions it within the broader framework of the primeval history, which proceeds from the creation of the world through the flood to the genealogies that connect the universal story of early humanity with the particular history of the ancestors of Israel. The function of the Tower of Babel narrative within this larger literary structure has attracted attention from scholars who have analyzed its role in the transition from the universal to the particular, from the story of humanity as a whole to the specific covenant relationship that will occupy the remainder of the Pentateuch and indeed the Hebrew Bible in its entirety. The geographical and historical context within which the Tower of Babel narrative was composed has significant implications for understanding its meaning and purpose. The reference to Babel, which Hebrew readers would have understood as Babylon, situates the narrative within a specific political and cultural geography that carried powerful associations for Israelite and later Jewish audiences. Babylon had conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE, an event of catastrophic significance for the Judahite community whose religious and political institutions centered upon the city and its sanctuary. The deportation of significant portions of the Judahite population to Babylon created the circumstances within which much of the Hebrew Bible achieved its present form, as scribes, priests, and scholars working in exile collected, edited, and transmitted the literary heritage of their ancestors while reflecting upon the theological meaning of the catastrophe that had befallen them. The representation of Babylon in texts composed or edited during and after the exile frequently emphasizes themes of pride, hubris, and divine judgment that resonate clearly with the Tower of Babel narrative, suggesting that the story may have acquired particular significance or undergone particular shaping within the context of the exilic experience. The theological interpretation of the Tower of Babel narrative within Jewish tradition developed through centuries of commentary and reflection that identified multiple dimensions of meaning within the relatively brief biblical text. Rabbinic interpreters elaborated upon the narrative's sparse details, speculating about the specific nature of the tower's construction, the identity and motivations of its builders, and the precise mechanism by which divine intervention disrupted their project. The Babylonian Talmud and various midrashic collections preserve interpretive traditions that read the narrative as addressing fundamental questions about human nature, divine providence, and the proper relationship between human ambition and religious humility. Some interpretive traditions emphasize the arrogance of the builders who sought to wage war against heaven itself, while others focused upon the social dimensions of the narrative, noting that the punishment of linguistic confusion and geographical scattering destroyed the unity and cooperation that had enabled the ambitious construction project. The diversity of rabbinic interpretation reflects the richness of a text that, despite its brevity, addresses themes of lasting significance for understanding human existence and divine action in the world. Christian interpretive traditions inherited and developed the themes identified by earlier Jewish commentators, while adding distinctively Christian perspectives that read the narrative within the framework of salvation history, as understood through the New Testament. The connection between the Tower of Babel and the Pentecost narrative in Acts chapter 2 became a standard element of Christian interpretation, as the gift of tongues that enabled the apostles to preach the gospel in languages understood by representatives of all nations was understood as reversing, or at least addressing, the linguistic division that had resulted from the Babel incident. This typological reading positioned the Tower of Babel as part of the problem that the coming of Christ and the establishment of the church were meant to solve, interpreting the confusion of languages as one dimension of the fallen condition of humanity that would be overcome through divine redemption. The Church Fathers, including Augustine, Jerome, and Chrysostom, offered interpretations of the Babel narrative that emphasized its moral and spiritual lessons while integrating it within broader frameworks of Christian theology and biblical hermeneutics. The Islamic tradition preserves references to the tower story within the Quran and subsequent commentarial literature, though the Quranic treatment differs in significant respects from the biblical account. The Pharaoh of Egypt, rather than the inhabitants of Babylon, is associated with tower building in Quranic references, as passages in Surahs 28 and 40 describe Pharaoh commanding the construction of a high tower that would enable him to reach the God of Moses. Islamic commentators and historians, including al-Tabari, preserved and elaborated upon traditions concerning the Tower of Babel that combined elements from biblical, rabbinic, and independent Near Eastern sources, creating a rich interpretive tradition that placed the narrative within Islamic understandings of prophetic history and divine guidance of human affairs. The figure of Nimrod, who appears briefly in Genesis as a mighty hunter and founder of cities including Babylon, acquired particular significance in Islamic tradition as the archetypal tyrant who opposed the patriarch Abraham and whose reign encompassed the Tower of Babel episode. The Renaissance and early modern periods witnessed renewed engagement with the Tower of Babel narrative as scholars, artists, and theologians sought to understand its implications within the context of expanding knowledge about the world and its peoples. The European encounter with the Americas and the recognition that vast populations had existed in complete isolation from the civilizations of the Old World raised new questions about the unity of humanity and the mechanisms by which human beings had dispersed across the globe. The Tower of Babel narrative provided a framework within which Christian thinkers could account for the existence of peoples whose languages bore no apparent relationship to those of Europe, Africa, or Asia, interpreting their isolation as a consequence of the post-Babel dispersion that had scattered humanity across the earth. The proliferation of languages documented by missionaries, explorers, and early linguists seemed to confirm the basic thrust of the biblical narrative while raising questions about the specific number and classification of human languages that had resulted from the divine intervention at Babel. The artistic representation of the Tower of Babel achieved particular prominence during the 16th and 17th centuries, as painters including Peter Bruegel the Elder created iconic images that shaped subsequent visualization of the narrative. Bruegel's celebrated tower paintings, completed in 1563 and now housed in Vienna and Rotterdam, depicted a massive spiral structure rising from a landscape populated with tiny human figures whose efforts seemed simultaneously ambitious and futile against the scale of the architecture they were attempting to construct. The influence of classical descriptions of the Colosseum and other Roman structures, combined with knowledge of Mesopotamian ziggurats, to produce an architectural form that represented the Tower of Babel as a monument of unprecedented scale, whose very ambition testified to the pride that would precipitate its abandonment. The visual tradition, established by Bruegel and his contemporaries, provided the imagery through which subsequent generations imagined the biblical narrative, creating an interpretive framework that shaped understanding of the text even among readers who approached it with purely literary or historical interests. The Enlightenment period brought new critical perspectives to the Tower of Babel narrative, as scholars began to apply rational and historical methods to texts that had previously been approached primarily through theological interpretation. The recognition that the Genesis narratives incorporated mythological and legendary elements alongside whatever historical memories they preserved created space for reading these texts as human documents that reflected the understanding and concerns of their ancient authors, rather than as divine revelation requiring acceptance in all particulars. The comparative study of mythology that developed during the 18th and 19th centuries situated the Tower of Babel narrative within a broader context of flood stories, creation accounts, and ideological narratives that appeared across multiple ancient cultures, suggesting patterns of cultural transmission and parallel development that complicated earlier assumptions about the unique status of biblical tradition. The Tower of Babel story could now be analyzed as an example of the ideological myth form, a narrative that explained the origin of some observed phenomenon, in this case, linguistic diversity and the geographical distribution of human populations through a story of primordial events. The development of historical linguistics during the 19th century provided scientific methods for investigating the questions that the Tower of Babel narrative had addressed through mythological imagination. The recognition that languages could be classified into families based upon systematic correspondences in vocabulary, grammar, and sound systems enabled scholars to trace the historical relationships between languages and to reconstruct earlier stages of linguistic development. The comparative method developed by Franz Bopp, Jacob Grimm, and their successors demonstrated that languages as apparently different as Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and the Germanic languages derived from a common ancestor, which scholars termed Proto-Indo-European, creating a scientific account of linguistic diversification that did not require supernatural intervention. The extension of comparative linguistic methods to other language families, including Semitic, Uralic, and Sino-Tibetan, revealed patterns of differentiation and descent that suggested linguistic diversity had developed through natural processes of change and divergence operating over extended time periods rather than through a single catastrophic event of the type described in Genesis. The relationship between the scientific study of language origins and the Tower of Babel narrative generated varying responses among 19th and 20th century scholars and theologians. Some interpreters maintained that the biblical account preserved accurate historical memory of a divine intervention that had initiated the process of linguistic differentiation, while acknowledging that subsequent development had followed natural laws. Others adopted approaches that distinguished between the theological significance of the narrative, which addressed questions of human pride and divine judgment, and its historical claims, which need not be accepted literally in order to appreciate the spiritual lessons the text conveyed. The recognition that the Genesis narratives incorporated elements from earlier Mesopotamian traditions provided context for understanding how the Tower of Babel story had developed, while raising questions about the specific sources and influences that had shaped its present form within the Hebrew Bible. The physical remains of Mesopotamian ziggurats continued to provide material evidence that could be compared with the biblical description during the 20th century, as archaeological investigation revealed additional structures and refined understanding of those already known. The ziggurat at Ur, excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, emerged as one of the best preserved examples of the architectural form, its massive brick core surviving to a height sufficient to indicate the original scale and configuration of the structure. Woolley's reconstruction of the ziggurat's appearance, based upon the surviving remains and comparative evidence from other sites, provided a visual reference that shaped subsequent understanding of how these temple towers had functioned within Mesopotamian religious practice. The discovery that the ziggurat had been built by Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, and substantially restored by the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus some 1,500 years later, demonstrated the exceptional longevity of the ziggurat tradition and the importance attached to maintaining these structures across the millennia. The archaeological investigation of Babylon itself, where the original Edamananki would have stood, has faced particular challenges due to the site's complex history of occupation, destruction, and reconstruction, as well as the practical difficulties of excavating in an area with high water tables that limit access to earlier levels. The German expedition that worked at Babylon under Robert Koldewey's direction between 1899 and 1917 exposed significant portions of the Neo-Babylonian city, including the Ishtar Gate, the Processional Way, and the foundations of the ziggurat complex, though the ziggurat itself had been so thoroughly dismantled in antiquity that only its foundation platform could be traced. The cuneiform texts describing Edamananki's dimensions and appearance have therefore remained the primary evidence for reconstructing the structure, supplemented by comparative evidence from better preserved ziggurats at other sites. The relationship between the textual descriptions and the archaeological remains has enabled scholars to develop increasingly refined models of the ziggurat's original appearance, though significant uncertainties remain regarding architectural details that the ancient sources do not specify with sufficient precision. The question of whether the Tower of Babel narrative preserves historical memory of a specific structure or event, as opposed to reflecting more general knowledge of Mesopotamian ziggurat traditions, has continued to engage scholars who approach the text from historical rather than purely literary perspectives. The hypothesis that the narrative originated during the Babylonian exile, when Judahite deportees would have observed the impressive remains or ongoing reconstruction of Edamananki, provides a plausible context for the incorporation of ziggurat imagery into biblical tradition, though alternative theories proposing earlier dates of composition remain defensible. The specific features emphasized in the Genesis account, particularly the use of brick and bitumen as building materials, correspond accurately to Mesopotamian construction practices, suggesting that the narrative reflects genuine familiarity with the architectural techniques employed in that region rather than purely imaginative elaboration. The motivation attributed to the builders, their desire to make a name for themselves and avoid dispersion across the earth, may likewise reflect understanding of the religious and political functions that ziggurats served within Mesopotamian society, where these structures symbolized the power and piety of the rulers who constructed them. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the Tower of Babel narrative extends far beyond its original religious and literary contexts to influence Western thinking about language, communication, and human cooperation across many centuries. The image of the tower, whose construction was halted by divine intervention, has served as a powerful symbol for the difficulties that linguistic and cultural diversity create for human collaboration, as well as for the ambiguity inherent in technological and civilizational ambition. The phrase Tower of Babel entered common usage as a metaphor for any situation characterized by confusion, miscommunication, or the failure of collective effort due to fundamental incompatibilities of understanding or purpose. Projects and institutions attempting to overcome linguistic barriers, from universal language schemes to international organizations, have frequently invoked the Babel imagery, sometimes positioning themselves as efforts to restore the unity that had been lost through divine judgment. The artificial language movements that emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries drew explicitly upon Babel imagery in articulating their purposes and aspirations. The creators of Volapük, Esperanto, and numerous other constructed languages proposed these systems as means of restoring linguistic unity to humanity, enabling communication across national and cultural boundaries without privileging any particular natural language over others. Ludwig Zamenhof, whose Esperanto became the most successful of these artificial languages, expressed his project in terms that resonated with the Tower of Babel tradition, envisioning a future in which humanity would share a common auxiliary language that would enable cooperation and mutual understanding while preserving the diversity of natural languages for local and cultural purposes. The persistence of such efforts throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, despite their limited practical success, testifies to the enduring appeal of the vision that the Babel narrative had articulated in negative form, the dream of human unity and mutual comprehension that linguistic diversity seemed to obstruct. The relationship between linguistic diversity and cultural creativity has become a subject of significant scholarly investigation during recent decades, as researchers across multiple disciplines have explored the cognitive, social, and evolutionary dimensions of human language capacity. The endangered language documentation movement, which has mobilized linguists and anthropologists to record and preserve languages at risk of extinction, has emphasized the irreplaceable value of linguistic diversity for understanding the range of human cognitive and cultural possibility. Each language, according to this perspective, represents a unique repository of knowledge, conceptual categories, and expressive resources that cannot be translated without loss into other linguistic systems, making the death of a language an impoverishment of human heritage comparable to the destruction of a library or museum. This valuation of linguistic diversity inverts the traditional reading of the Tower of Babel narrative, suggesting that the multiplication of languages should be understood not as punishment, but as enrichment, the provision of the varied perspectives and resources necessary for humanity to address the full range of challenges and opportunities that existence presents. The archaeological investigation of Mesopotamian ziggurats during the 19th and 20th centuries transformed scholarly understanding of the ancient Near East, while simultaneously providing material context for evaluating the historical dimensions of the Tower of Babel tradition. The systematic excavation of major Mesopotamian sites, beginning with the pioneering work of European archaeologists and continuing through increasingly sophisticated modern investigations, revealed the physical remains of numerous ziggurats across the regions corresponding to ancient Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria, demonstrating that these structures represented a characteristic and persistent feature of Mesopotamian religious architecture across several millennia. The ziggurat at Ur, excavated primarily by Leonard Woolley during the 1920s and 1930s, emerged as one of the best preserved examples of the genre, its massive lower stages surviving to substantial height and providing detailed evidence for Mesopotamian construction techniques, building materials, and architectural design principles. Woolley's meticulous documentation of the Ur ziggurat revealed the elaborate engineering employed to ensure structural stability across the centuries, including the incorporation of drainage systems, the use of matting layers between courses of brickwork, and the careful calculation of wall thicknesses to distribute the enormous weight of the superstructure across the underlying foundation. The excavations at other major sites, including Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, and Assur, produced additional ziggurat remains that enabled comparative analysis of the architectural tradition across different periods and regional contexts, revealing both common features that united the ziggurat concept and local variations that reflected the particular circumstances and resources of individual cities. The investigation of Babylon itself, where the original ziggurat associated with the Tower of Babel tradition would have stood, presented particular challenges due to the site's complex history of destruction, reconstruction, and eventual abandonment, as well as the limitations imposed by modern political circumstances on archaeological access to Iraqi sites. The German excavations at Babylon conducted under Robert Koldewey between 1899 and 1917 represented the most sustained systematic investigation of the ancient city, uncovering extensive remains of the Neo-Babylonian period, including portions of the city walls, the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the foundations of major temple complexes. Koldewey's team located and partially excavated the site of Edamananki, finding the massive foundation platform that had supported the ziggurat, along with evidence for the structure's enormous scale. Though the centuries of destruction and stone robbing that had occurred following Babylon's abandonment had removed virtually all of the superstructure that had risen above the foundation level. The excavation records documented the dimensions of the surviving foundation, which corresponded closely to the measurements provided in the Esagila tablet and other cuneiform sources describing the structure, confirming that the textual accounts of Edamananke's scale reflected actual architectural reality rather than literary exaggeration or idealization. The foundation platform measured approximately 91 meters on each side, establishing the base dimensions from which the stepped superstructure would have risen to its ultimate height of perhaps 90 meters, dimensions that would have made Etemenanke one of the largest structures in the ancient world, and certainly the most imposing religious monument in Mesopotamia during its periods of existence. The material evidence recovered from the excavations included numerous baked bricks bearing stamped inscriptions identifying Nebuchadnezzar II as the builder, confirming the attribution of the final major reconstruction to that monarch and providing physical documentation for the building campaigns described in the royal inscriptions. The subsequent history of Etemenanke following the Neo-Babylonian period illustrated the processes through which such monumental structures could disappear from the landscape, leaving only foundation traces and literary memories to attest to their former existence. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE initiated a period of gradual decline for the city and its religious institutions, though the Achaemenid rulers initially maintained the traditional temples and continued to support their priesthoods as part of their strategy of accommodating local religious traditions within the imperial framework. Xerxes I, who ruled the Persian Empire from 486 to 465 BCE, is reported by Greek sources to have destroyed or damaged Babylonian temples following a rebellion. Though the precise nature and extent of his actions against Etemenanke remain subjects of scholarly debate given the limited and potentially biased nature of the evidence. Alexander the Great, upon his conquest of Babylon in 331 BCE, reportedly found Etemenanke in a state of disrepair and ordered the removal of debris as a preliminary to reconstruction, though his death in 323 BCE prevented the completion of this ambitious project and left the ziggurat to continue its slow deterioration. The Seleucid successors who inherited control of Babylon following Alexander's death initially maintained interest in the city and its monuments, but the foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris as a new royal capital drew population and resources away from Babylon, accelerating the decline of the ancient city and its religious infrastructure. By the time of the Parthian period, Babylon had shrunk to a modest settlement within the enormous circuit of its ancient walls, and Etemenanke had been reduced to a massive mound of crumbling brickwork that served primarily as a convenient source of building materials for local construction projects. The transformation of Etemenanke from functioning temple to rubble heap to archaeological site illustrates the broader processes through which ancient Mesopotamian civilization disappeared from living memory, surviving only in fragmentary textual traditions, classical references, and the mounds that dotted the landscape of what became Islamic Iraq. The local populations who inhabited the region during the Islamic period knew these mounds as tells, artificial hills created by the accumulated debris of centuries of human occupation, though they had largely lost knowledge of the specific histories and functions of the structures buried within them. Local traditions sometimes associated particular mounds with biblical or Islamic figures, creating folkloric connections between the visible landscape and the religious narratives that provided frameworks for understanding the past, though these associations rarely corresponded to the actual archaeological realities revealed by later excavation. The mound of Birs Nimrud, located southwest of the main Babylon site, attracted particular attention from European travelers and scholars as a potential candidate for the original Tower of Babel, its massive surviving remnant of a ziggurat stage appearing sufficiently impressive to sustain identification with the legendary structure. Claudius James Rich, the British resident at Baghdad during the early 19th century, conducted some of the first systematic observations of Mesopotamian ruins, including both the main Babylon mound and Birs Nimrud, publishing accounts that stimulated European interest in the archaeological potential of the region, while contributing to debates about the identification of biblical sites. The physical evidence for Mesopotamian construction techniques recovered through these various excavations confirmed the accuracy of the Genesis account regarding building materials, while illuminating the practical challenges that ziggurat construction posed for ancient builders. The use of mud brick as the primary building material, with baked brick employed for exterior surfaces and critical structural elements, represented the standard Mesopotamian approach to monumental architecture, necessitated by the absence of building stone in the alluvial plains while enabling the creation of structures of enormous scale through the application of organized labor and accumulated resources. The bitumen mentioned in the Genesis account as serving in place of mortar corresponded to the natural asphalt deposits that occur in various locations throughout Mesopotamia, which ancient builders employed as waterproofing material, adhesive, and mortar depending on the specific requirements of particular construction projects. The availability of bitumen seeps in the region around Babylon and further upstream along the Euphrates provided convenient access to this material, which ancient texts confirm was transported considerable distances for use in major building projects. The technological sophistication evident in Mesopotamian construction practices, including the careful selection and treatment of different grades of bitumen for different purposes, the coordination of brick production with construction scheduling, and the engineering calculations required to ensure structural stability across extended time periods, demonstrated that ziggurat construction represented a significant organizational and technical achievement requiring the mobilization of state resources on a substantial scale. The relationship between archaeological evidence and biblical narrative has remained a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion, with different researchers emphasizing different aspects of the connection between the Tower of Babel story and the historical reality of Mesopotamian ziggurats. The minimalist position, which some scholars have advocated, suggests that the biblical account represents pure literary creation, inspired at most by general awareness of Mesopotamian architectural traditions, with no direct connection to any specific historical structure or event. This interpretation emphasizes the ideological function of the narrative, its purpose in explaining linguistic diversity through divine action rather than reporting historical occurrences, and suggests that the search for a specific historical referent for the Tower of Babel may be fundamentally misguided. The maximalist position, by contrast, proposes that the narrative preserves genuine historical memory of a specific building project, possibly the construction or reconstruction of Etemenanke, transformed through transmission into the legendary account preserved in Genesis, and that archaeological investigation can legitimately seek to identify the material correlates of the biblical tradition. Between these poles, moderate positions have suggested that the narrative combines legendary elements with genuine familiarity with Mesopotamian conditions, reflecting the experience of Israelite exiles in Babylon who observed or learned about local ziggurat construction while interpreting these observations through their own religious and cultural frameworks. The cuneiform textual evidence bearing on ziggurat construction has provided essential context for evaluating these various interpretive positions, documenting both the practical procedures involved in building these structures and the religious significance attributed to them by ancient Mesopotamian populations. Royal inscriptions commemorating ziggurat construction or reconstruction typically emphasize the piety of the monarch who undertook the work, presenting the building project as fulfillment of divine mandate and continuation of traditions established by previous rulers. Nebuchadnezzar II's inscriptions regarding Etemenanke, which survive in multiple copies, describe his efforts to complete and perfect the structure begun by his father Nabopolassar, raising the ziggurat to its full height and adorning it with blue-glazed bricks that would have created a striking visual effect visible from considerable distance across the flat Babylonian landscape. The language of these inscriptions emphasizes the cosmic significance of the structure, presenting it as the link between heaven and earth that enabled communication between human and divine realms, a conception that resonates interestingly with the Genesis account's emphasis on the tower's intended function of reaching the heavens. The Esagila tablet, a clay tablet dating to the Seleucid period that provides detailed measurements for both Etemenanke and the associated Temple of Marduk, has proved invaluable for reconstructing the appearance of the fully completed ziggurat, though its late date raises questions about whether it describes the structure as it actually existed or as later generations remembered or idealized it. The religious functions of Mesopotamian ziggurats, as documented through textual sources and inferred from archaeological evidence, provide important context for understanding both the structures themselves and the ways in which foreign observers might have interpreted them. The temple that crowned the ziggurat served as the dwelling place of the deity, the location where the god's presence was understood to reside within the cult statue that formed the focus of worship and the destination of elaborate ritual processions that marked the major festivals of the religious calendar. The high temple's elevation above the surrounding city landscape symbolized the transcendence of divine power, while simultaneously making that power accessible through the mediation of priestly ritual, a conceptual framework that informed both the architectural design of the ziggurat and the religious practices conducted within and around it. The daily rituals of feeding, clothing, and attending the cult statue, which numerous cuneiform texts describe in considerable detail, transformed the abstract deity into a concrete presence requiring physical care, a conception of divine-human relationship that differed significantly from the transcendent monotheism that would eventually characterize biblical religion. Foreign observers encountering these practices might well have interpreted the ziggurat and its rituals as expressions of human presumption, attempts to manipulate or control divine power that violated proper understanding of the relationship between human and divine realms. An interpretation that would align with the theological perspective expressed in the Tower of Babel narrative. The intellectual history of Babel interpretation across the centuries demonstrates the narrative's capacity to generate new meanings in different cultural contexts, while maintaining its fundamental themes of human ambition, divine response, and linguistic fragmentation. Medieval Christian interpreters typically read the story within frameworks provided by church tradition, understanding it as illustration of the sin of pride and the consequences of human rebellion against divine order, while simultaneously employing it to explain the diversity of peoples and languages that characterize the known world. The identification of specific languages as descendants of the original tongues, created at Babel, became a subject of scholarly speculation, with Hebrew frequently assigned priority as the original language of humanity preserved through the line of Shem, a position that reinforced biblical authority while providing conceptual organization for understanding linguistic relationship. The geographical distribution of peoples described in the Table of Nations, which immediately precedes the Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis, was correlated with known populations of the medieval world, creating comprehensive schemes that assigned every people to descent from one of Noah's 3 sons, and thereby to a specific position within the post-Babel dispersion. These interpretive frameworks combined biblical authority with contemporary geographical and ethnological knowledge, producing synthetic understandings that served both religious and practical purposes, while establishing conceptual precedents that would influence subsequent centuries of thought about human diversity and its origins. The Renaissance and early modern periods witnessed significant developments in Babel interpretation as increased knowledge of both ancient languages and non-European peoples complicated traditional frameworks while stimulating new forms of inquiry. The rediscovery of classical texts provided additional information about ancient Babylon and its monuments, enabling scholars to supplement biblical accounts with descriptions from Greek and Roman authors who had either visited the region or drawn upon earlier sources that had access to more complete information. Herodotus's description of Babylon, including his account of the great temple of Zeus Belus, which modern scholars identify with Etemenanke, provided an independent ancient witness to the existence and scale of the structure, though his reliability on specific details remained subject to scholarly debate. The exploration of the Americas following 1492 dramatically expanded European awareness of human diversity, presenting populations whose existence traditional Babel-based frameworks had difficulty accommodating and whose languages showed no obvious relationship to those of the Old World. The question of American Indian origins became intertwined with Tower of Babel interpretation, as scholars proposed various theories explaining how descendants of the Babel dispersion might have reached the Western Hemisphere, including suggestions of ancient maritime voyages, land bridges through unknown northern regions, or descent from the 10 lost tribes of Israel. These debates demonstrated both the flexibility of biblical interpretive frameworks and the strains that expanding empirical knowledge placed upon traditional understandings, foreshadowing more fundamental challenges that would emerge during subsequent centuries. The development of comparative philology during the 18th and 19th centuries transformed understanding of linguistic relationship while providing new contexts for evaluating the Tower of Babel tradition. The recognition that Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and numerous other languages shared common features that indicated descent from a single ancestral language established the concept of language families on scientific foundations, demonstrating that languages changed through regular processes that could be studied and reconstructed through systematic comparison. The Indo-European hypothesis, which proposed that most languages of Europe and significant portions of South and Central Asia descended from a common proto-language spoken by a prehistoric population, contradicted simple Babel-derived models while simultaneously confirming the reality of linguistic relationship and historical connection that earlier frameworks had attempted to explain through biblical genealogy. The extension of comparative methods to other language families, including Semitic, Uralic, and numerous others, further complicated the picture, revealing a world of linguistic diversity that could not be adequately explained by simple dispersion from a single point, but required recognition of multiple independent origins and complex patterns of contact, divergence, and convergence across deep time. The apparent absence of any demonstrable relationship between certain language families, despite considerable effort to discover such connections, suggested that human linguistic diversity might exceed what any single origin model could accommodate, challenging both literal interpretation of the Babel narrative and the assumption of original linguistic unity that it presupposed. The modern academic study of linguistics has approached the Tower of Babel tradition from perspectives informed by these developments while continuing to find the narrative relevant for understanding historical attitudes toward language and communication. The distinction between synchronic and diachronic approaches to language study, between analysis of language systems as they function at particular moments and investigation of how languages change through time, provided conceptual frameworks that enabled scientific treatment of linguistic phenomena independent of traditional origin narratives. The recognition that all known languages possess equivalent expressive capacity, that no language is more primitive or advanced than any other in fundamental respects, challenged evolutionary assumptions that had characterized earlier approaches while affirming the equal dignity of all human linguistic traditions. The documentation of language change processes, including regular sound shifts, grammatical transformation, vocabulary borrowing, and the development of new varieties through contact and isolation, explained linguistic diversity through natural mechanisms operating across extended time periods rather than through singular supernatural intervention. These scientific understandings did not necessarily contradict the Tower of Babel narrative, understood as theological reflection on human limitation and divine providence, but they did remove the empirical burden from the traditional account, allowing it to function symbolically without requiring literal historical correspondence to documented linguistic processes. The archaeological investigation of Mesopotamian ziggurats during the 19th and 20th centuries provided material evidence that transformed scholarly understanding of the structures that might have inspired the Tower of Babel tradition, while raising new questions about the relationship between physical remains and literary memory. The excavations conducted by European archaeologists at numerous sites across modern Iraq revealed the foundations and fragmentary remains of steppe temple platforms that had dominated the religious landscapes of ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cities, demonstrating that monumental tower construction represented a widespread and enduring feature of Mesopotamian civilization rather than an isolated phenomenon limited to a single legendary structure. The systematic documentation of ziggurat remains at Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Borsippa, and numerous other sites establish the architectural characteristics that define this distinctive building type, including the use of mud brick construction with baked brick facing, the arrangement of successively smaller platforms creating stepped profiles that rose toward elevated summit temples, and the incorporation of elaborate drainage systems designed to protect the massive earthen cores from water damage that threatened structural integrity across the centuries. The scale of these structures, which in their original forms reached heights of 30 meters or more, while covering base areas exceeding 4,000 square meters, confirmed the capacity of ancient Mesopotamian societies to undertake construction projects of extraordinary ambition, mobilizing labor forces, material resources, and technical expertise on scales that must have seemed overwhelming to observers from simpler cultural contexts. The identification of specific ziggurats mentioned in ancient inscriptions allowed correlation between textual references and archaeological remains, enabling scholars to trace the histories of individual structures across centuries of construction, destruction, repair, and abandonment that characterized the volatile political environment of the ancient Near East. The excavation of Etemenanke, the great ziggurat of Babylon, presented particular challenges and opportunities for scholars investigating potential connections to the Tower of Babel tradition, given the explicit identification of Babylon as the setting for the biblical narrative and the prominence that this specific structure had achieved in ancient sources. The German excavations at Babylon, conducted between 1899 and 1917 under the direction of Robert Koldewey, revealed the foundations of the ziggurat complex. Though centuries of brick removal for subsequent construction projects had reduced the once towering structure to little more than its base platform and the waterlogged pit created by quarrying below the water table. The architectural analysis of the remaining foundations, combined with information preserved in the Asagila tablet and other ancient descriptions, enabled scholarly reconstruction of the ziggurat's original appearance, suggesting a structure approximately 90 meters in height, comprising 7 stages of decreasing size, crowned by a temple dedicated to Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. The correspondence between these reconstructed dimensions and the detailed measurements recorded in ancient texts provided confirmation that written descriptions preserved accurate information about structures that subsequent destruction had rendered otherwise unknowable, validating the use of textual evidence where archaeological remains proved insufficient. The date of Etemenanke's original construction remained difficult to establish with certainty, though references in texts from the reign of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE suggested that some form of ziggurat had existed at Babylon by that period, with subsequent rulers undertaking repairs, expansions, and reconstructions that culminated in the massive structure described by Herodotus and documented in late Babylonian administrative texts. The relationship between the physical Etemenanke and the literary Tower of Babel raised interpretive questions that archaeological evidence alone could not resolve, requiring consideration of how memory, tradition, and religious polemic might have transformed historical structures into legendary monuments. The Genesis narrative presented the tower construction as a project undertaken by unified humanity before linguistic division, placing the events in a primordial period that predated the historical chronologies preserved in Mesopotamian sources and positioning the story within a different conceptual framework than the administrative records documenting actual construction projects. The differences between the biblical account, which emphasized human hubris and divine punishment, and the Mesopotamian sources, which celebrated ziggurat construction as expressions of royal piety and cosmic order, suggested that the Genesis version represented not straightforward historical memory, but rather critical engagement with Mesopotamian religious claims from an Israelite perspective that rejected the theological assumptions underlying temple tower worship. The possibility that Israelite exposure to Babylonian ziggurats during the exile of the 6th century BCE had influenced the development of the Babel narrative received support from the prominence of Babylon in the story and the evident familiarity with monumental architecture that the account presupposed, though definitive conclusions about the narrative's compositional history remained subject to ongoing scholarly debate. The broader pattern of Israelite engagement with Mesopotamian traditions, evident in the relationship between Genesis flood narratives and earlier Sumerian and Babylonian versions, demonstrated that biblical writers participated in wider cultural conversations while adapting inherited materials to serve distinctive theological purposes that often subverted the original meanings of borrowed motifs. The investigation of the Borsippa ziggurat, known in antiquity as Urim-Enanki, provided an interesting counterpoint to the focus on Etemenanki while contributing to popular understanding of the Tower of Babel tradition through processes of mistaken identification that persisted into modern times. The ruins at Borsippa, located approximately 18 kilometers southwest of Babylon, preserved the most substantial remains of any Mesopotamian ziggurat, with portions of the structure rising to heights of 47 meters above the surrounding plain in a dramatically eroded form that suggested a tower struck by catastrophic destruction. The vitrified appearance of the upper portions, where intense heat had fused the mud brick material into glass-like masses, contributed to interpretations linking the Borsippa ruins to divine punishment, with some early observers proposing that lightning or supernatural fire had destroyed the structure in ways that confirmed biblical accounts of heavenly intervention. The actual explanation for the vitrified remains involved natural processes of brick firing and weathering rather than catastrophic destruction, though the dramatic appearance of the ruins continued to attract religious pilgrims and curious travelers who preferred legendary associations to prosaic archaeological explanations. The persistent identification of Borsippa, rather than Babylon, as the Tower of Babel site demonstrated the power of visible remains to shape popular understanding, as the more impressive surviving structure attracted attention that the largely vanished Etemenanki could not command. Regardless of scholarly consensus regarding the relative merits of competing identifications, the development of Assyriology as an academic discipline during the 19th century transformed the study of Mesopotamian civilization while providing increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding the cultural contexts within which ziggurat construction had occurred and from which Tower of Babel traditions might have emerged. The decipherment of cuneiform script, accomplished through the combined efforts of scholars including Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert, opened access to vast archives of Mesopotamian texts that documented religious, administrative, literary, and historical matters in unprecedented detail, enabling reconstruction of ancient thought worlds that had remained inaccessible while the writing system remained unreadable. The recovery of Sumerian as a distinct language underlying later Akkadian cuneiform traditions revealed the existence of an entire civilization predating the Semitic cultures previously known from biblical and classical sources, pushing the documented history of Mesopotamia back into the 4th millennium BCE, and demonstrating that the region had witnessed continuous cultural development across time spans far exceeding traditional biblical chronologies. The accumulation of textual evidence regarding religious beliefs and practices illuminated the theological significance of ziggurats within Mesopotamian worldviews, showing how these structures functioned as cosmic mountains connecting earthly and heavenly realms, as dwelling places for deities who descended to receive worship, and as expressions of royal ideology that legitimated political authority through association with divine favor. The detailed documentation of temple rituals, festival calendars, and priestly organizations revealed the elaborate institutional structures that supported ziggurat worship, demonstrating that these monuments served as centers of complex religious systems rather than isolated architectural curiosities whose meaning could be understood apart from their functional contexts. The application of modern scientific techniques to archaeological investigation added new dimensions to understanding of Mesopotamian architecture while enabling analysis of questions that earlier methods had been unable to address. The use of remote sensing technologies, including satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, allowed identification of buried structures and settlement patterns across landscapes too extensive for traditional excavation, revealing the full extent of ancient urban systems within which ziggurats had functioned as focal points. The chemical analysis of construction materials provided information about resource procurement, technical processes, and environmental conditions that shaped building practices, demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of material properties that ancient builders had developed through accumulated practical experience. The dating of organic materials associated with construction contexts through radiocarbon analysis enabled correlation of architectural sequences with absolute chronologies, refining understanding of when particular structures had been built, modified, and abandoned. The application of structural engineering analysis to ziggurat remains revealed the sophisticated techniques ancient builders had employed to manage the immense loads and hydraulic pressures that threatened massive mud brick constructions, demonstrating technical capabilities that exceeded what casual observation of surviving ruins might suggest. The comparative study of monumental architecture across ancient civilizations provided broader contexts for understanding Mesopotamian ziggurats, while raising questions about the relationship between similar forms in different cultural traditions. The pyramids of Egypt, constructed as royal tombs rather than temple platforms, shared with ziggurats the characteristic of massive scale, achieved through stepped construction, though the different functions and meanings attached to these structures cautioned against assuming that formal similarity necessarily indicated cultural connection or shared symbolic significance. The stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica, developed independently by civilizations with no demonstrable contact with Old World traditions, demonstrated that similar architectural solutions could emerge from different cultural contexts, challenging assumptions that tower construction required diffusion from a single origin point. The Buddhist stupas of South and Southeast Asia, the Temple Mountains of Angkor, and various other monumental forms attested to the widespread human impulse to construct elevated sacred spaces that mediated between earthly and heavenly realms, suggesting that ziggurat construction represented one regional expression of a broader pattern rooted in common features of human religious imagination rather than specific historical transmission. These comparative perspectives did not necessarily diminish the significance of the Tower of Babel tradition, but rather situated it within broader contexts of human engagement with height, monumentality, and cosmic symbolism that transcended particular cultural boundaries. The political history of modern Iraq significantly affected access to archaeological sites and the progress of scholarly investigation, as international conflicts, regime changes, and economic instability created conditions that alternately facilitated and impeded research. The excavations conducted during the period of British mandate following World War I established the foundations of systematic Iraqi archaeology while training local scholars who would continue the work under subsequent governmental arrangements. The development of Iraqi national institutions, including the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and the Department of Antiquities, created infrastructure for heritage preservation and research that enabled continued investigation during periods of relative stability. The conflicts that characterized later decades, including the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Gulf War of 1991, and the invasion of 2003, caused direct damage to archaeological sites through military operations while creating conditions of instability that enabled looting and destruction on scales that represented irreparable losses to historical knowledge. The particular attention that Babylon received as a symbol of Iraqi national identity led to reconstruction projects during the Saddam Hussein era that, while intended to celebrate ancient heritage, caused archaeological damage through construction activities that compromised stratified deposits and altered the appearance of ancient remains. The recovery of Iraqi archaeology from these disruptions remained ongoing, with international collaboration and the training of new generations of Iraqi scholars representing essential components of efforts to rebuild damaged institutional capacity. The theological interpretation of the Tower of Babel narrative continued to evolve within religious communities that maintained engagement with traditional texts while responding to changing intellectual and cultural contexts. The recognition that the biblical account functioned primarily as theological reflection rather than historical chronicle enabled reading strategies that honored the narrative's religious significance without requiring literal correspondence to documented events, allowing believers to engage with archaeological and linguistic evidence without experiencing such engagement as threatening to faith. The interpretation of the Babel story as commentary on human tendencies toward prideful overreach, the dangers of unified power unchecked by diversity, and the mysterious relationship between divine providence and human limitation provided frameworks for contemporary application that transcended questions of historical accuracy. The reading of linguistic diversity not as punishment, but as gift, not as curse, but as blessing that enriched human experience through multiplied perspectives and creative possibilities, represented a theological development that inverted traditional emphases while maintaining continuity with ancient interpretive traditions that had always recognized multiple meanings within scriptural narratives. The engagement of liberation theology with the Babel narrative, interpreting the story as critique of imperial pretension and celebration of resistance to homogenizing power, demonstrated the continued capacity of ancient texts to address contemporary concerns through processes of creative reinterpretation that honored both the alterity of the original context and the pressing questions of the present moment. The linguistic dimensions of the Tower of Babel tradition invited continued reflection on the nature of language, communication, and human community that extended beyond narrowly religious contexts into broader philosophical and cultural discussions. The question of whether linguistic diversity represented a fall from original unity or an expression of natural variety that required no explanation through catastrophic intervention remained relevant for understanding different approaches to multilingualism, translation, and cross-cultural communication. The ideal of a universal language that might overcome the limitations imposed by linguistic diversity, pursued through various constructed language projects from Esperanto to more recent computational approaches, reflected continued engagement with assumptions embedded in the Babel narrative, even among those who rejected the story's literal truth. The development of machine translation and artificial intelligence raised new questions about the possibility of transcending linguistic boundaries through technological means, suggesting that the dream of restored communication might be achievable through human invention rather than divine intervention, though the limitations of such technologies also demonstrated the depth of the challenge that linguistic diversity posed for mutual understanding. The preservation of endangered languages, representing responses to the ongoing loss of linguistic diversity through processes of globalization and cultural homogenization, inverted traditional Babel interpretations by positioning diversity as valuable heritage requiring protection rather than as punishment requiring remedy. The artistic and literary engagement with the Tower of Babel tradition demonstrated the continued cultural vitality of the narrative through creative works that explored its themes while adapting its imagery to contemporary concerns and aesthetic sensibilities. The paintings of Peter Bruegel the Elder, particularly his two surviving Tower of Babel compositions from the 16th century, established visual conventions that shaped subsequent artistic treatment while embedding particular interpretations that emphasized the futility of human ambition against divine order. The Romantic era fascination with ruins and the sublime found in the Tower of Babel a compelling subject that united antiquarian interest, religious meditation, and aesthetic appreciation of monumental decay, generating artistic works that reflected contemporary sensibilities while claiming connection to ancient traditions. The modernist engagement with fragmentation, alienation, and the breakdown of communication found in the Babel narrative, a mythological framework for expressing experiences that seemed specifically contemporary while possessing ancient precedent, enabling works that used traditional imagery to address unprecedented conditions. The science fiction exploration of alien contact, artificial intelligence, and post-human possibility frequently drew upon Babel themes, imagining scenarios in which the boundaries of language and species might be transcended or reinforced through technological development, extending the narrative's concerns into speculative futures while maintaining continuity with ancient questions about the limits and possibilities of communication. The educational treatment of the Tower of Babel tradition reflected broader tensions between religious and secular approaches to historical knowledge, while demonstrating the difficulty of maintaining clear boundaries between categories that overlapped in complex ways. The presentation of the narrative in religious education contexts emphasized theological meanings and spiritual applications that positioned the story within frameworks of faith and moral instruction, treating historical questions as secondary to the primary purpose of religious formation. The treatment of Mesopotamian ziggurats in archaeological and historical education necessarily engaged with the same material evidence while employing different interpretive frameworks that emphasized empirical investigation and naturalistic explanation, creating potential tensions for students who encountered both approaches within their educational experiences. The effort to maintain appropriate distinctions between religious and scientific modes of inquiry, while acknowledging the legitimacy of both, represented an ongoing challenge for educators who sought to honor diverse traditions without promoting confusion about the nature and limits of different forms of knowledge. The recognition that the Tower of Babel tradition belonged simultaneously to religious heritage and cultural history, to communities of faith and communities of scholarship, to ancient Near Eastern studies and contemporary theological reflection, suggested that adequate treatment required acknowledgement of multiple valid perspectives rather than insistence on single authoritative interpretations. The question of how the Tower of Babel narrative might continue to function in future contexts invited speculation about the trajectory of human civilization itself, particularly regarding the technologies and social arrangements that might either reunify or further fragment human communication across the coming centuries. The development of increasingly sophisticated translation technologies capable of providing instantaneous conversion between languages with growing accuracy and nuance suggested possibilities for practical communication that previous generations could not have imagined, raising questions about whether technological solutions might eventually render linguistic diversity functionally irrelevant for purposes of mutual understanding, even while preserving the existence of distinct languages as markers of cultural identity and heritage. The emergence of global communication networks that connected individuals across linguistic and cultural boundaries with unprecedented immediacy created conditions that both reinforced and complicated the Babel narrative's assumptions about the relationship between communication and human unity, demonstrating that shared access to information did not automatically produce shared understanding or common purpose. The concentration of global communication in a relatively small number of languages, particularly English as the dominant medium of international exchange in scientific, commercial, and diplomatic contexts, represented a form of linguistic consolidation that some observers interpreted as reversal of Babel's scattering, though others noted that such consolidation often came at the cost of marginalized languages and the communities whose identities remained bound to linguistic traditions threatened by global pressures. The question of whether humanity might eventually converge upon a single shared language through natural processes of globalization, whether such convergence would represent fulfillment of ancient aspirations for restored unity or loss of the diversity that enriched human culture, and whether technological mediation might make such convergence unnecessary by enabling seamless communication across persistent linguistic boundaries, remained open for consideration by those who thought seriously about the long-term future of human civilization. The relationship between the Tower of Babel tradition and contemporary concerns about artificial intelligence raised particularly interesting questions about the nature of language, understanding, and the boundaries between human and non-human forms of cognition. The development of large language models capable of generating coherent text across multiple languages and of translating between languages with increasing sophistication suggested new possibilities for overcoming communicative barriers, though the question of whether such systems actually understood language in any meaningful sense or merely manipulated patterns without genuine comprehension remained contested among researchers and philosophers. The possibility that artificial intelligence might eventually develop forms of communication that transcended human linguistic limitations, whether through direct exchange of information without the mediation of natural language or through creation of new symbolic systems optimized for machine cognition, raised questions about whether the boundaries imposed at Babel might be transcended not through human achievement, but through the emergence of non-human intelligences that operated according to different principles. The scenario in which artificial intelligences might serve as universal translators, enabling humans to communicate with each other through technological mediation that handled all linguistic conversion automatically, suggested a future in which the practical effects of linguistic diversity might be largely overcome even while the underlying diversity persisted, creating conditions quite different from either the pre-Babel unity or the post-Babel fragmentation described in the traditional narrative. The deeper question of whether such technological mediation would actually restore the kind of communication that the Babel narrative suggested had been lost, or whether it would create new forms of connection that differed fundamentally from the direct understanding that had supposedly characterized human interaction before the divine intervention, remained open for philosophical and theological reflection. The consideration of humanity's future in space, including the possibility of permanent settlements on other planets and eventual expansion throughout the solar system and beyond, raised questions about whether such expansion might produce new forms of linguistic and cultural divergence that would make terrestrial diversity appear modest by comparison. The scenario in which human communities separated by vast distances and minimal communication might develop increasingly distinct languages and cultures over generations, eventually becoming as different from each other as the most divergent terrestrial societies, suggested that the process of differentiation might continue indefinitely as humanity spread across cosmic distances. The question of whether the Babel narrative might be understood not as describing a singular historical event, but as articulating a pattern inherent in human expansion and diversification, one that would repeat itself whenever communities achieved sufficient separation to develop independently, offered an interpretation that connected ancient mythology to speculative futures while treating both as expressions of permanent human tendencies. The possibility that technological developments might maintain communication across interplanetary or even interstellar distances, preventing the kind of isolation that had produced terrestrial linguistic diversity, suggested alternative futures in which human unity might be preserved through technological means even as geographical expansion continued, though the challenges of maintaining meaningful communication across light years of distance and centuries of transmission time remained formidable. The theological question of whether divine purposes that had scattered humanity at Babel might be understood as applying only to terrestrial unity or as governing human aspiration more generally, including expansion into cosmic realms, invited speculation about the relationship between ancient religious narratives and futures that their original authors could not have imagined. The environmental and ecological dimensions of the Babel narrative, while not explicit in the original text, became increasingly relevant as contemporary concerns about human impact on planetary systems raised questions about the appropriate scope of human ambition and the proper relationship between humanity and the natural world. The tower that had sought to reach heaven could be understood in ecological interpretation as representing the kind of unbounded technological aspiration that threatened to destabilize the systems upon which human survival depended, making the divine intervention a warning about the dangers of exceeding appropriate limits, rather than merely a punishment for pride or disobedience. The fragmentation of human communication that resulted from Babel could be understood in this ecological reading as serving the function of limiting the scale at which humans could coordinate their activities, preventing the kind of unified action that might have threatened the stability of the entire planet through coordinated environmental destruction. The contemporary situation in which humanity possessed the technological capacity to affect global systems while lacking the communicative and political coordination necessary to address such effects, collectively represented a peculiar condition in which the limitations imposed at Babel created obstacles to addressing threats that those limitations had themselves made possible. The question of whether overcoming the barriers to human coordination was essential for addressing global challenges, or whether such coordination would enable forms of collective action that might prove even more destructive than the uncoordinated impacts that currently threatened planetary systems, remained contested among those who considered the political and environmental implications of human unity and division. The psychological and therapeutic engagement with the Tower of Babel tradition reflected contemporary interest in using mythological and religious narratives as resources for personal development and emotional healing, treating ancient stories as repositories of wisdom about the human condition rather than as historical accounts requiring literal acceptance. The interpretation of the Babel narrative as expressing universal human experiences of miscommunication, isolation, and failed aspiration offered individuals frameworks for understanding their own struggles with connection and understanding, positioning personal difficulties within a cosmic narrative that simultaneously validated the reality of suffering and suggested its place within larger patterns of meaning. The use of the Babel story in family therapy and conflict resolution, treating it as illustrating the breakdown of communication that occurred when individuals pursued separate agendas without attention to shared understanding, demonstrated the practical application of ancient narratives to contemporary relational challenges. The recognition that the desire to build towers reaching to heaven might represent not only collective human ambition, but also individual tendencies toward grandiosity, and the denial of limitation suggested psychological applications that treated the narrative as relevant to personal development and self-understanding. The question of whether the scattering at Babel might be understood as representing not only punishment, but also the necessary differentiation that enabled individuals and communities to develop distinct identities, moving from fusion toward healthy separation, offered psychologically informed interpretations that found positive meaning in the narrative's apparent tragedy. The relationship between the Tower of Babel tradition and contemporary discussions of cultural diversity, multiculturalism, and the challenges of pluralistic societies raised questions about how ancient narratives might inform approaches to living together across different and increasingly interconnected societies. The interpretation of linguistic diversity as divine punishment suggested perspectives that might view cultural pluralism as a problem to be overcome, while interpretations that found positive value in diversity suggested perspectives that might celebrate cultural difference as enriching human experience rather than diminishing it. The tension between these interpretive possibilities reflected broader debates within contemporary societies about whether the goal of multicultural coexistence should be assimilation into common cultures or preservation of distinct traditions, whether unity required homogeneity or could accommodate fundamental differences, and whether communication across cultural boundaries required abandonment of particular identities or could be achieved while maintaining them. The recognition that the Babel narrative had been used to justify both ethnocentric tribalism and universalist cosmopolitanism, both the celebration of particular linguistic and cultural traditions and the aspiration toward transcendence of such particularity, demonstrated the text's capacity to serve diverse ideological purposes while raising questions about which interpretations most faithfully reflected its original meanings and which might prove most valuable for contemporary application. The consideration of disability, accessibility, and alternative forms of communication raised questions about the assumptions underlying the Babel narrative and about how those assumptions might be reconsidered in light of contemporary understandings of human diversity and capability. The traditional interpretation of Babel as describing the loss of verbal linguistic unity presupposed that spoken language represented the primary or natural form of human communication, an assumption challenged by recognition of the sophistication and completeness of sign languages and by awareness of the diverse forms of communication employed by individuals whose circumstances precluded reliance on spoken language. The question of whether the unity described before Babel might be reimagined as encompassing multiple modes of communication, not limited to spoken language, but including gestural, visual, and other forms of symbolic exchange, suggested interpretive possibilities that honored the communicative capacities of all humans rather than privileging particular modalities. The recognition that communication barriers existed not only between speakers of different languages, but also between those who employed different modalities of communication, and that overcoming such barriers required attention to accessibility and accommodation, extended Babel's concerns to dimensions of human diversity that the original narrative had not explicitly addressed. The development of technologies that facilitated communication for individuals with various disabilities, from text-to-speech systems to communication boards to brain-computer interfaces, raised questions about how such developments might be understood in relation to the Babel narrative's themes of linguistic limitation and the possibility of restored communication. The narrative's treatment of divine motivation and the nature of the intervention that scattered humanity continued to generate theological reflection that sought to reconcile the story's apparent portrayal of a jealous or fearful deity with more developed understandings of divine nature and purpose. The traditional interpretation that God had acted to prevent humanity from achieving forbidden knowledge or power sat uncomfortably with theological traditions that emphasized divine love, generosity, and desire for human flourishing, creating tensions that required either reinterpretation of the narrative or modification of theological assumptions. The reading of the divine intervention as protective rather than punitive, understanding the scattering as preventing humanity from pursuing forms of unity that would have proved ultimately destructive, offered one approach to resolving this tension while raising questions about the nature of the threat that unified humanity supposedly posed. The interpretation that located the problem not in human capability per se, but in the spiritual condition of humanity at that historical moment, suggesting that unity among unredeemed humans would have produced evils that diversity prevented, offered another approach that maintained traditional understandings of human sinfulness while presenting the divine intervention as merciful rather than jealous. The recognition that the Babel narrative functioned within larger biblical frameworks that included promises of eventual restoration and renewed unity suggested that the scattering might be understood as temporary rather than permanent, as a pedagogical measure within a longer divine program rather than as final judgment, offering hope that the limitations imposed at Babel might ultimately be transcended through divine action. The linguistic dimensions of the Babel narrative, particularly its treatment of the relationship between language, thought, and reality, continued to attract attention from scholars interested in the philosophy of language and in the ways that different cultures understood the nature and function of linguistic expression. The suggestion that prior to Babel humanity had possessed not merely a common language, but complete mutual understanding, raised questions about whether such understanding was conceived as resulting from linguistic uniformity or as involving forms of communication that transcended linguistic mediation entirely. The question of whether the multiplicity of languages imposed at Babel affected only the surface forms of linguistic expression or altered more fundamental structures of thought and perception, creating genuinely different ways of understanding reality rather than merely different ways of expressing common understandings, remained relevant for contemporary debates about linguistic relativity and the relationship between language and cognition. The philosophical traditions that understood language as shaping rather than merely expressing thought found in the Babel narrative a mythological account of how such shaping might have occurred, treating the diversity of languages as creating genuinely different mental worlds that their speakers inhabited. The traditions that understood language as a tool for expressing pre-linguistic thoughts found in the narrative an explanation for why communication proved difficult, despite the underlying commonality of human cognition, treating linguistic diversity as obscuring rather than creating cognitive differences. The recognition that both perspectives captured aspects of the complex relationship between language, thought, and communication suggested that the Babel narrative's ambiguity on these questions might reflect genuine complexity in the phenomena being addressed, rather than mere confusion or lack of precision. The material culture associated with the Tower of Babel tradition, including artistic representations, architectural inspirations, and physical objects created in response to the narrative, demonstrated the ways that religious and mythological traditions became embedded in the material world through human creative activity. The countless paintings, sculptures, and architectural elements that depicted or referenced the Tower of Babel created a visual vocabulary that shaped how the narrative was understood and remembered, with artistic conventions establishing interpretive frameworks that persisted across generations even as the theological significance of the images might shift. The use of Babel imagery in architecture, including buildings that deliberately evoked the tower through spiral forms or excessive height, demonstrated the ways that the narrative's themes of ambition, aspiration, and divine judgment could be embedded in physical structures that communicated meaning through their forms. The creation of illustrated Bibles, stained glass windows, and other religious objects that included Babel imagery made the narrative a constant presence in the visual environment of religious communities, ensuring that its themes remained accessible even to those who might not engage directly with the textual tradition. The contemporary commercial use of Babel references in naming, branding, and design demonstrated the continued cultural currency of the narrative, even as its religious significance might have diminished for many who encountered such references, suggesting that the tower had become a general cultural symbol whose specific religious meanings were not always consciously engaged by those who invoked its imagery. The relationship between the Tower of Babel tradition and the history of translation, including both the theoretical understanding of translation and the practical institutions and technologies that enabled it, offered perspectives on how humanity had responded to the conditions that the narrative described. The recognition that translation represented not merely mechanical conversion between linguistic codes, but creative interpretation that required understanding of cultural contexts, idiomatic expressions, and implicit assumptions, demonstrated both the difficulty of overcoming Babel's legacy and the remarkable human capacity for bridge building across linguistic difference. The development of translation theory from ancient approaches that emphasized literal correspondence through contemporary understandings that acknowledged the creative and interpretive dimensions of the translator's work reflected changing assumptions about the relationship between languages and about the possibility and limits of cross-linguistic communication. The institutional development of translation services, from the translation bureaus of ancient empires through medieval translation centers to contemporary professional translation organizations, demonstrated the sustained human investment in overcoming communicative barriers that the Babel narrative had made necessary. The emergence of computational translation, capable of processing texts in milliseconds that would require human translators hours or days, represented a technological development whose implications for the Babel tradition remain to be fully understood, suggesting possibilities for overcoming linguistic barriers that exceeded what human translation alone could achieve, while also raising questions about the nature and limits of machine understanding. The theological and philosophical implications of computational translation extended far beyond mere questions of practical utility, touching on fundamental assumptions about the nature of language, understanding, and the relationship between human cognition and divine intention that the Babel narrative had encoded. The ability of artificial systems to produce translations that human readers found comprehensible and useful raised questions about whether such systems were genuinely understanding the languages they processed or merely manipulating symbols according to patterns extracted from vast quantities of human-produced text, with the answer to this question carrying significant implications for how the Babel tradition's claims about language and consciousness should be interpreted. The philosophical debates surrounding computational understanding, including the famous thought experiments designed to demonstrate the difference between syntactic manipulation and genuine semantic comprehension, found unexpected resonance with ancient discussions of whether Babel's punishment had affected merely the surface forms of human speech or the deeper cognitive capacities that language both expressed and shaped. The practical effectiveness of computational translation systems, capable of enabling communication between speakers of languages that had been mutually unintelligible for millennia, suggested that whatever the theoretical debates about machine understanding might conclude, humanity had developed tools capable of partially reversing the communicative fragmentation that the Babel narrative described, though whether such reversal should be celebrated or feared remained a matter of theological dispute. The contemporary linguistic landscape, characterized by both unprecedented possibilities for cross-linguistic communication and accelerating language death as smaller languages disappeared under pressure from global dominant tongues, presented conditions that the Babel tradition could illuminate from multiple directions. The recognition that thousands of the world's languages faced extinction within the coming generations, as their last native speakers died without passing their linguistic heritage to younger generations, raised questions about whether such losses represented natural processes of consolidation or tragic diminishments of human cognitive and cultural diversity that the Babel tradition had made possible. The efforts of linguists, anthropologists, and endangered language communities themselves to document and revitalize threatened languages reflected an understanding of linguistic diversity as valuable in itself, worthy of preservation even at considerable cost, that found support in interpretations of the Babel narrative that understood linguistic proliferation as ultimately beneficial despite its origins in divine judgment. The simultaneous emergence of global communication systems that enabled instantaneous contact between speakers of any language, provided translation services were available, and the disappearance of linguistic communities that had maintained distinct traditions for countless generations created conditions of unprecedented paradox. As humanity became simultaneously more connected across linguistic barriers and less linguistically diverse in the totality of its communicative resources. The relationship between the Tower of Babel tradition and contemporary questions about collective human endeavors, including the great technological and political projects that characterized modern civilization, offered frameworks for understanding both the possibilities and dangers of coordinated human action on unprecedented scales. The construction projects of the contemporary world, including structures that dwarfed anything that ancient builders could have imagined, raised questions about whether humanity had successfully circumvented whatever limitations the Babel narrative described, or had merely displaced the divine concern to other domains where the consequences of excessive ambition might manifest differently. The recognition that modern construction relied on technologies and organizational systems that enabled coordination despite linguistic and cultural diversity suggested that humanity had developed means of achieving collective action that did not require the linguistic unity that Babel's builders had possessed, though whether such coordination could match the seamless cooperation that a single language might enable remained uncertain. The great engineering achievements of the contemporary period, from the transportation networks that connected continents to the communication systems that enabled instantaneous global contact, represented collective human accomplishments that exceeded in scale and complexity anything the ancient world had produced. Yet the persistence of conflict, misunderstanding, and failed cooperation suggested that the underlying conditions the Babel narrative described continued to constrain human possibilities. The political dimensions of the Tower of Babel tradition's contemporary relevance included questions about global governance, international cooperation, and the possibilities and limits of unified human action in response to challenges that affected all of humanity regardless of linguistic or cultural boundaries. The emergence of international institutions designed to facilitate cooperation across the divisions that the Babel narrative described, including the United Nations and its specialized agencies, the international financial institutions, and the countless treaties and agreements that sought to coordinate human action across national and linguistic boundaries, represented sustained efforts to overcome the fragmentation that had characterized human affairs since the mythological scattering. The limited success of such institutions, capable of achieving coordination in some domains while failing catastrophically in others, suggested that the conditions the Babel narrative described continued to impose constraints that political and institutional innovation could mitigate but not eliminate. The contemporary challenges that required global cooperation for effective response, including climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation, and the governance of emerging technologies, tested whether humanity could achieve the coordination that such challenges demanded, or whether the legacy of Babel would prevent the unified action that survival might require. The technological dimensions of contemporary relevance extended to questions about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, and other domains where human capability was expanding in ways that ancient traditions could hardly have anticipated. The development of artificial intelligence systems capable of tasks that had previously required human cognition raised questions about whether such systems represented new forms of the tower-building ambition that the Babel narrative had condemned, or merely tools that extended human capabilities without fundamentally altering humanity's relationship to the divine constraints the tradition described. The possibilities of genetic engineering, including the modification of human biology itself, raised questions about whether humanity was approaching capacities that divine limitations had been designed to prevent, with the Babel narrative's warning about the dangers of unified human ambition, finding new applications in debates about the governance of biotechnology. The exploration and potential colonization of other worlds raised questions about whether humanity's expansion beyond Earth represented the fulfillment of divine intentions for human flourishing, or the kind of overreaching ambition that had prompted the Babel scattering, with both interpretive possibilities finding advocates among those who sought to understand human destiny through the lens of ancient traditions. The environmental dimensions of the Tower of Babel tradition's contemporary relevance included questions about humanity's collective impact on the planetary systems that sustained all life, with the scale of contemporary environmental transformation raising questions about whether such transformation represented appropriate stewardship or dangerous overreach. The recognition that human activity had become a geological force capable of altering climate, extinguishing species, and transforming landscapes on continental scales suggested that humanity had achieved capacities for collective action that exceeded what the Babel narrative's original authors could have imagined. Yet the inability to coordinate effective responses to environmental degradation demonstrated that the communicative and cooperative limitations the narrative described continued to constrain human possibilities. The debates about environmental policy that divided nations, cultures, and linguistic communities reflected the persistence of the conditions that the Babel tradition had made fundamental to human affairs. As groups that might have cooperated effectively to address shared challenges, instead pursued divergent approaches that reflected their distinct perspectives, interests, and understandings of the problems they faced. The possibility that environmental transformation might produce consequences that threatened human civilization itself raised questions about whether the Babel scattering, by preventing unified human action, had introduced constraints that might ultimately prove fatal to the species whose ambitions it had been designed to limit. The spiritual and psychological dimensions of the Tower of Babel tradition's contemporary relevance included questions about meaning, purpose, and the human condition that transcended the specific theological frameworks within which the narrative had traditionally been interpreted. The recognition that the story addressed fundamental aspects of what it meant to be human, including the tension between individual and collective identity, the relationship between ambition and limitation, and the search for connection with transcendent realities, suggested that its relevance extended to all who grappled with such questions, regardless of their religious commitments or lack thereof. The existentialist interpretations of the narrative that had emerged in the 20th century, treating the tower as a symbol of humanity's futile attempts to create meaning in an indifferent universe, found continued resonance among those who experienced modernity's conditions of fragmentation and alienation as fundamental features of human existence rather than mere temporary difficulties to be overcome through progress. The psychological interpretations that understood the narrative as addressing internal fragmentation, the multiplicity of voices within the individual psyche that prevented unified action even within a single person, offered frameworks for understanding conditions of inner conflict and division that many contemporary individuals experienced as central to their personal struggles. The interfaith dimensions of the Tower of Babel tradition's contemporary relevance included the ways that Jewish, Christian, and Islamic interpreters continued to engage with the narrative from their distinct theological perspectives, while also finding in it resources for dialogue and mutual understanding across religious boundaries. The recognition that all three Abrahamic traditions claimed the Babel narrative as part of their sacred heritage while interpreting its meaning through distinct theological frameworks, created possibilities for conversation about shared concerns that the narrative addressed. The Jewish interpretive traditions that emphasize the importance of linguistic diversity and the dangers of enforced uniformity offered perspectives that could enrich Christian and Islamic understandings, while also challenging interpretations that understood Babel primarily as punishment to be overcome through restored unity. The Christian traditions that connected Babel to Pentecost and to the universal mission of the Church offered perspectives on the relationship between unity and diversity that could inform Jewish and Islamic thinking about similar questions. The Islamic traditions that emphasized the role of linguistic diversity in manifesting divine wisdom offered perspectives that could enrich Jewish and Christian understandings of why such diversity might be valued rather than merely tolerated. The possibilities for interfaith dialogue that the Babel tradition opened, including discussions of language, diversity, unity, ambition, and divine intention, suggested that the ancient narrative could serve as a meeting ground where representatives of different religious traditions could explore their common heritage while respecting their genuine differences. The archaeological investigations of Mesopotamian ziggurat sites continued to generate findings that illuminated the material conditions within which the Babel tradition had emerged, even as the specific historical events or structures that might have inspired the narrative remained matters of scholarly debate. The ongoing excavations at sites throughout the region, formerly known as ancient Mesopotamia, now divided among multiple modern nations whose political conditions sometimes facilitated and sometimes prevented archaeological work, produced evidence about the construction techniques, social organization, and religious practices of the civilizations that had built the monumental structures the Babel tradition might have remembered. The development of new archaeological technologies, including remote sensing techniques capable of detecting buried structures without excavation, and dating methods capable of providing precise chronologies for ancient remains, promised to generate additional evidence that might clarify the relationship between the Babel narrative and the historical realities it might have encoded. The challenges of conducting archaeological research in regions marked by political instability, conflict, and competing claims to cultural heritage demonstrated how contemporary conditions continued to affect humanity's ability to recover knowledge of its ancient past, with the fragmentations that the Babel tradition described manifesting in the difficulties that prevented unified international approaches to understanding shared human heritage. The interpretive tradition surrounding the Tower of Babel had generated insights that remained valuable regardless of whether the specific historical claims embedded in the narrative could be verified, as the story's engagement with fundamental questions about language, unity, diversity, and human ambition transcended the particular circumstances of its composition. The recognition that myths could be true in senses that exceeded mere historical accuracy, capturing essential features of human experience that factual accounts might fail to convey, suggested that the Babel narrative's continuing power derived from its successful articulation of experiences and concerns that remained relevant across the millennia since its composition. The scholarly debates about the narrative's origins and meaning, far from diminishing its significance, demonstrated the richness of a tradition that could sustain multiple interpretive approaches while remaining recognizable as addressing concerns that contemporary readers could identify as their own. The artistic, literary, and philosophical engagements with the Babel tradition that had occurred across countless cultures and centuries demonstrated the narrative's capacity to inspire creative responses that extended its meanings in directions its original composers could not have anticipated. The Tower of Babel tradition thus occupied a unique position in the inheritance that humanity had received from its ancient past, serving simultaneously as a religious scripture demanding faithful interpretation, a historical source encoding memories of actual events and conditions, a literary masterpiece demonstrating techniques of narrative composition, a philosophical text engaging fundamental questions about language and consciousness, and a cultural symbol available for appropriation in contexts far removed from its original setting. The narrative's capacity to function in all these modes simultaneously, without any single mode exhausting its significance, suggested that it had achieved a kind of perfection in addressing the complexities of human experience that more specialized texts could not match. The continued engagement with the Babel tradition across the boundaries of culture, language, and time that the narrative itself had described demonstrated that the story retained its power to illuminate human conditions even for those who might not share the specific theological commitments within which it had originally been articulated. The question of what the Tower of Babel tradition ultimately meant, what it revealed about humanity's past and suggested about its future, admitted no simple answer that could command universal assent, and this very undecidability might represent the tradition's most profound insight into the conditions it described. The recognition that different interpreters, approaching the narrative from their distinct linguistic, cultural, and theological perspectives, would reach different understandings of its significance, demonstrated in practice the very phenomenon that the narrative had made central to human affairs, as the diversity of interpretation reflected the diversity of standpoint that the Babel scattering had produced. The possibility that no unified interpretation could be achieved, that the narrative would continue to generate divergent readings as long as readers approached it from divergent perspectives, suggested that Babel's legacy included not only the diversity of languages, but the diversity of understandings that different linguistic and cultural communities would develop even when engaging with identical texts. The recognition that this diversity of interpretation need not be lamented as a failure of communication, but could be celebrated as a manifestation of human creativity, each interpretive community contributing something distinctive to the collective human engagement with shared heritage, offered a way of understanding the Babel tradition that found value rather than mere tragedy in the conditions it described. The tower that humanity had attempted to build, whether understood as a physical structure in ancient Mesopotamia or as a symbol for collective human ambitions that exceeded divine tolerance, had failed to achieve its purpose of reaching the heavens and preventing the dispersion that its builders feared. Yet the memory of that failed attempt had itself become a kind of monument, not built of brick and bitumen, but of words and interpretations, stories and meanings that had been constructed and reconstructed across the millennia since the original events or their mythological representation had occurred. This monument of memory, unlike the physical tower it commemorated, had proven capable of enduring, surviving the destruction of the civilizations that had first told the story and the transformations of the languages in which it had been transmitted. The Tower of Babel, in becoming a story, had achieved a kind of immortality that the physical structure could never have attained, its meanings preserved and extended through the very diversity of languages that its narrative explained, each linguistic community contributing its distinctive interpretation to the collective monument of human memory. The plains of ancient Mesopotamia, where the story placed the tower's construction and destruction, had themselves become monuments to the civilizations that had risen and fallen upon them, their tells and ruins preserving evidence of human achievement and catastrophe that archaeologists continued to recover and interpret. The relationship between the physical landscape and the textual traditions that had described it demonstrated the complex ways that human memory preserved the past, with material remains and written records, each contributing what the other could not provide to the reconstruction of vanished worlds. The possibility that somewhere beneath those plains lay the remains of the specific structure that had inspired the Babel tradition, waiting for discovery by archaeologists whose technologies might eventually penetrate the accumulated debris of centuries, reminded observers that the boundary between myth and history remained permeable, and that narratives dismissed as mere legend might encode memories of actual events that future investigation could confirm. The legacy of the Tower of Babel extended beyond the specific narrative to encompass the entire complex of human responses to the conditions of linguistic and cultural diversity that the story had explained and that human history had exemplified. Every act of translation, every effort at cross-cultural communication, every institution designed to facilitate cooperation across linguistic boundaries represented a response to Babel's legacy, an attempt to overcome or accommodate the fragmentation that the narrative had made central to human affairs. The successes and failures of such attempts, the remarkable achievements of human bridge building across difference, and the persistent conflicts that demonstrated the limits of such efforts, together constituted the ongoing history of humanity's engagement with the conditions that the Babel tradition had described. The future would bring new challenges that would test humanity's capacity for coordination, new technologies that would create unprecedented possibilities for communication or miscommunication, and new interpretations of the ancient narrative that would discover in it meanings relevant to circumstances its original composers could never have imagined. The Tower of Babel stood at last not as a ruin in the Mesopotamian plain, though such ruins might indeed exist awaiting discovery, but as a presence in human consciousness, a symbol whose meanings had been elaborated across millennia and whose relevance showed no signs of diminishing as humanity confronted the challenges of an uncertain future. The builders who had sought to make a name for themselves, to achieve a unity that would prevent their scattering across the earth, had failed in their immediate purposes, yet had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation in ensuring that their story would be remembered, that the questions they had raised would continue to be asked, that the tensions between unity and diversity, ambition and limitation, human striving and divine constraint that their narrative embodied would remain central to human self-understanding for as long as humans continued to reflect on their condition. The story that had begun with humanity speaking a single language and ended with that language shattered into incomprehensible fragments had itself become a kind of universal language, translated into every tongue, interpreted by every culture, appropriated by every generation that sought to understand the mystery of human diversity and the possibility of human unity. The Tower of Babel, incomplete and abandoned in the narrative that preserved its memory, had been completed in a sense that its original builders could never have intended, its construction continuing across the centuries as each generation added its interpretations to the monument, its purpose fulfilled not in reaching the heavens, but in connecting humanity across the divisions of time and space and language that separated communities from one another and from their ancient past. The scattered descendants of those ancient builders, now numbering in billions and speaking thousands of distinct languages across every continent of the earth and even beyond it in the tentative human presence in space, remained connected to one another and to their mythological ancestors through the story that explained their diversity and challenged them to overcome it. The tower remained unfinished, as perhaps it was meant to remain, its completion reserved for a future that the narrative itself had left undefined, when the conditions it described might finally be transcended and humanity might achieve the unity that had eluded the builders on the Mesopotamian plain. Until that day, if such a day could ever come, the Tower of Babel would continue to rise in human memory and imagination, its foundations laid in ancient Mesopotamia, and its pinnacle reaching toward a heaven that remained always beyond human grasp. A monument to human ambition and human limitation, to the diversity that divided and the dreams that united, to the ancient question that echoed still across the millennia of human striving. Whether the children of Adam would ever again speak with a single voice, and what they might say, and what they might build, and whether the heavens would again take notice of their labors.